In the Theaetetus, which is one of the many dialogues, Plato looks at knowledge and opinion, and he draws a distinction between the two. On his view, opinion is belief. Now, in order to develop his epistemology, he faces off against three main opponents, or views he must refute. The first is relativism, the idea that truth is relative and not objective. The second is empiricism, the idea that all knowledge about the world comes via the senses. And lastly, the view that knowledge is merely true belief, that is, believing it and being right is enough. In the Theaetetus, he advances his argument against relativism. Now, he does agree with the obvious. Some things are in fact relative. To use an obvious example, think about cool versus warm. If you have someone from Maine, like myself, who grew up in snow and ice, Florida seems, especially Tallahassee, seems very warm, rather hot year-round. Someone who grew up someplace warmer than Tallahassee, like hell, for example, grew up someplace much warmer, Tallahassee might seem chilly. And so the same exact temperature to two different people may feel quite different. So how we feel about warmth and cold is relative. And Plato agrees with that. He's not going to argue against that. His concern, though, is with a broader form of relativism, not just things feel different to different people, but that there is, no objective truth. Now, his first argument against it is that relativism is somehow self-refuting or self-defeating. And he makes this argument against Protagoras. Protagoras claimed that all opinions are true. And this, of course, sets it up for, a fairly easy refutation. The problem is, of course, for Protagoras, is that the opinions of Protagoras' opponents, who believe he is wrong, are also opinions. So, his belief is false if those who disagree with him have true beliefs. And you end up with this scenario, kind of a dilemma, because if he's right, then he's wrong, and if he's wrong, then he's wrong. A second argument against Protagoras is kind of an ad hominem against Protagoras. So it wouldn't work against relativism in general, but it's an attack against Protagoras because Protagoras charged for his teachings. And of course, an obvious question is, if Protagoras says, "Give me money and I'll teach you stuff," a good question would be, well, Protagoras, if you say everything is relative, there's no truth, how does one justify, how do you, Protagoras, justify charging me? So, what Protagoras claimed, that he was teaching people what they needed to know. But once he says that his teachings are better than those of others, he's given up his relativism. And so the problem he runs into is that since he wants to charge, he has to say it's better, but his relativism says that nothing is better. And again, this is only kind of an ad hominem against Protagoras. It doesn't defeat relativism in general. Now that Plato has defeated relativism, at least to his satisfaction, he turns to attacking or criticizing the idea that knowledge comes from the senses. The first problem of the senses he presents is this. He asserts that the senses only provide information about a world that is constantly changing. Because of this, we can't say what is true with certainty due to this change. We can only report how things appeared to us at a particular moment in time. To give an example, I can't see my truck from here, and the last time I saw it, it was not on fire. However, I can't say with certainty that my truck is not on fire now, even though, of course, it's raining because, Florida. It could still be on fire, so I don't know. So why would this matter? Why would the constant change matter? Well, Plato contends, he argues, that the objects of knowledge, that is, what it is you know, cannot be so fleeting and uncertain. So, because the objects of the senses are fleeting and uncertain, again, you can't say that you know what's happening now. You can only, somewhere else that you can't sense, you can only say how things appear to you, which is one problem, and you can only say how they appear to you at a particular moment in time in a particular place. So another problem there as well within this problem of the senses. So he concludes the senses cannot be a source of knowledge. His first argument. And he continues. The second problem of the senses is this. He argues that these objects of knowledge, that's to say what we know, need to have the qualities of being both universal and unchanging. He also asserts that we need to have unchanging definitions for these objects. We must have them. And the good question would be why? Well, he contends that if we did not have such definitions and the corresponding objects, and language only referred to the fleeting, changing objects of this world, then meanings would constantly change and language would stop working. Now, on one hand, this does have a certain plausibility, because if language just shifted too rapidly, we wouldn't be able to communicate. Imagine kind of a sci-fi scenario where a Twilight Zone episode or Outer Limits episode where every language is constantly changed and never referred to the same thing. Communication would be effectively impossible. But on the other hand, against Plato, our language does change. And so one might argue that as long as it doesn't change too fast, that we can keep up. His next argument is the perfect standard argument. Now, Plato notes that if you look at our world, physical things in this world fall short of perfection. So if we look at things like hand-drawn shapes, or even if we, had an incredible, high-resolution laser printer and printed it out, it may look, pretty good just looking at it. But if you took a magnifying glass or a microscope, you would see it was still going to be, jaggy and imperfect. Or if we take even things that are, abstract, like justice. We obviously do not see perfect justice in this world. And we also do not see things like perfect beauty. Because even the most beautiful person or beautiful thing still has flaws. So he's right about that. The world lacks perfection. So how does this help Plato? Well, what he claims is this. We know that these things, physical, geometric shapes we draw out, the justice and beauty we experience in the world, we know that they fall short because we have knowledge about something perfect. So his reasoning is the only way to know that, say, a circle printed on a printer is not perfect is to have a standard of perfection. The only way to know that justice in this world is not perfect is to have a standard of perfection. The only way to know that the most beautiful person is still not perfectly beautiful is to have a notion of perfection. He claims that you cannot gain this through the senses. Why? Well, this is kind of reasonable reasoning, namely that all that we observe through our senses is imperfect. So if it's true that we're matching things up against a standard of perfection, and we can't get the standard through the senses, then, well, we can't get that knowledge through the senses. Now, this, of course, can be criticized. One might contend that what we're doing is not comparing it to perfection, but comparing it to something somewhat better. So when we say, for example, that justice is not perfect, we don't have a conception of perfect justice, we just have a conception of better justice that we call perfect. We have kind of a fuzzy notion of perfection. Or you could argue you could get this knowledge through the senses, you just have a base level of, what you observe, and then you just kind of, as later thinkers like John Locke contend, you just kind of scale it up, so to speak. Now, it's an interesting kind of side point here. Plato is interestingly right in that the physical world does eventually fail us in terms of standards. To give a concrete example, when we're doing measurements today, we do measurements at an incredibly tiny level, like, quite a while ago, we do engineering, at a kind of small level. You do small moving parts and like watches and stuff, like around World War II. But then once you get into obviously things like, the CPU in your computer or, the chip in your phone, these things are measured at the nanometer scale. And when we're measuring stuff, of course, we need a standard. And they used to use like a standard meter bar, a physical object. But they found that because it's physical, it's imperfect. It kind of shrinks a little bit, even though it's, maintained carefully, or grows a little bit. And then they switched to a wavelength of light. But they found that even that's not exact. So interestingly enough, as sort of showing Plato's view and application, we're running into his perfect standard problem. Namely that our engineering is becoming so good that we're running into the limits of the physical world. Essentially, the defects in measurement and standards is impacting our ability to design stuff and measure stuff. So, interesting problem. But for Plato, his main point is we have this concept of perfect. We can't get it from the world of the senses, so it must come from somewhere else. So, at this point, with his three arguments, Plato believes that he has defeated empiricism. Although, of course, empiricism is still going today. So clearly the empiricists did not give up. Now, the last thing he has to defeat is the notion that knowledge is simply having a belief that is true. That is, knowledge is just right opinion. Now, Plato makes a distinction between simply having a true belief, having right opinion, and knowledge. What's the difference? Well, we'll see more of this in the future, but for him, the problem with the true opinion is that, to quote him in English, translation, is not willing to remain long. So true opinions, again to quote a translation, must be tied down by giving an account of the reason why. And so he begins, perhaps the first person to do this as far as we know, the idea that what separates true opinion and knowledge is that knowledge has a rational justification. And in epistemology, this seems to be the start of what's called the justified true belief notion of knowledge. That to know something, you got to believe it, easy part. It's got to be true, and it's got to be justified. And this later gets criticized and attacked throughout the centuries. Now, this view does seem reasonable in a way. To use a concrete example, think of like a math test. They typically expect people to show their work, and the reason why in part is to show that a person knows what they're doing. So a person could just guess. They could have like some kind of inspiration, they think they're getting, and just write down the correct answer. But if someone is taking a math test and they just guess and get it right, you wouldn't say that they know the answer. They just guessed. It was a true belief. It was true and they believed it, but we would not say they actually knew it. So, from these arguments, Plato comes up with a standard for knowledge. And again, our main focus here is on the metaphysics rather than the epistemology. So for him, knowledge is objective because he defeated the relativist, or so he believed. He also takes the view that it's not obtained by the senses because of his arguments against the senses. It's got to be universal and changeless, and also based in reason. So what does he come up with? Well, he essentially has like a job description. So whatever he comes up with as the object of knowledge has got to meet those conditions. And so he's got a, dual realm. The realm of the senses is a realm of particular things, which in philosophy speak is sometimes called tokens, individual, entities. And these are in constant flux. And we'll see in the future that he's kind of, saying, well, Heraclitus was right, there's all this change. These particular things, though, fall under categories in philosophy talk, or normal talk too, types. So what organizes all these things? Well, for Plato, the object of knowledge that does all this stuff is what is called a universal, sometimes called a Platonic form, and sometimes translated as idea. The kind of the standard in in philosophy is, for Plato, is Platonic form, and kind of the generic thing would be what's known as a universal. Now the particulars, individual things like you and me and everybody else, according to Plato, we participate in the forms, and we'll see in the future, that's super mysterious. And this makes us what we are. So to use, oversimplified example, we're all human, and so we participate in the form human. And we'll talk more about the forms in more detail in the future. Again, he also used other terms for the forms. Some translations take it to be ideas, but that would be kind of a bad translation, because these Platonic ideas are not things that just exist in your mind. They exist for real, really real for real, according to Plato at least. So how do we learn about these forms? Well, what Plato comes up with is this. He comes up in the dialogue of the Meno, the doctrine of recollection. Now, it's an entire dialogue, so there's a lot more to it than this, but the argument essentially is this. This is how you know about the forms, because he runs into this problem, because if you're here in the world, you're just encountering particulars, individuals who have, some beauty but are not perfectly beautiful, cases of justice that are not perfectly just, etc. So how do we have this knowledge? Well, in the Meno, Socrates is arguing with Meno. The dialogues are often named after the person Socrates is arguing with. So Meno presents a paradox of knowledge. If you do not know what you are seeking, then you will not know if you have found it. If you do know what you are seeking, then there is no need to seek, since you already know. And you can use an analogy to like car keys. Like if you don't know where they are, if you don't know what car keys you're looking for, if someone says, I lost my key, and you say, well, what type of key is it? And they say, I don't know. Well, you'll never know if you found it. Now, if you do know what it is and where it is, you have no need to seek, because you already know. So Plato's kind of extreme workaround is this. He claims that you have innate knowledge acquired before your soul enters your body. You don't get it through the senses here in the physical world. When your soul is not within your body, according to Plato, it communes with the forms, whatever that means. He's not super clear about that. And then when a person is reborn, and on many of Plato's accounts, like in the Republic, he talks about how when you die, you remain in the afterlife for 1,000 years. And after 1,000 years, you choose a new life, and you're reincarnated, you're reborn. Now, you might ask the obvious question, why don't I remember hanging out with these forms, and why don't I remember all my past lives? Now, there are, of course, people who do claim to remember past lives, and so Plato's theory does allow for that. If that, in fact, is true, that people are recalling past lives, then that would be helpful evidence for Plato's view. I mean, it doesn't guarantee Plato's particular view is right, but it would provide evidence for reincarnation, perhaps. So why don't you remember this stuff? Well, conveniently enough, according to Socrates, you forget that you know. But the knowledge is not destroyed, because in the Meno, what happens is Socrates walks one of Meno's servants through a geometric proof, and the argument is that since the servant could have not learned, this geometry, did not learn it in this life, but yet is able to do these proofs with Socrates asking him questions, or as the critics say, guiding him, this shows that he has the knowledge within him. All it takes is the use of the Socratic method, the dialectic, to have people recall it. To use a modern analogy, if you have a computer, laptop, desktop, etc., tablet, and you delete a file, throw it in the trash, or erase your whole hard drive, your files are still there. It's just that you've said to your computer, to use another analogy, it's like having a filing cabinet in the office, and you tell, a coworker, yeah, everything in there is, I don't want any of that anymore, so just throw it out if you need room. And so the stuff is still there, but it's just marked that it's been thrown away. And your trash kind of works like that on the computer. Until something is actually overwritten in your hard drive, it's still there. Which is why, as a practical matter, if you have an old computer and your hard drive, you get rid of it, be sure to, thoroughly overwrite the drive, or if you're really, concerned, physically destroy it. But anyways, back to the story. So if you have a hard drive that, the files are erased, either accidentally or intentionally, they can be recovered with this software because they're still there, not completely destroyed. And in a way, the dialectic is like that. It's like restoring the hard drive. So to go with the analogy, you're hanging out with the forms, you're loading all this information into your soul hard drive, and then you're reborn, and the shock, damages your soul directory. And so all the files are there, they're just, lost. And then what a philosopher does with the dialectic essentially is restore your files, and you regain that's perfect justice, that's the good, that's beauty, and then you regain all this metaphysical knowledge. Now, it's not what we consider, say, practical everyday knowledge, like things like what are the winning lottery numbers for next week, or how to cure or prevent COVID-19. It's things like the forms, and these are very abstract general things like beauty, justice, geometry. And so on Plato's view, you're learning stuff when you are dead, which may be why education sometimes hurts, because it reminds one of death. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.